after we come back. And the first two are these diversity indices, and it's very like the life tables. You follow the calculation, you fill in the thing, it'll give it to you at the end. The other two problems are about ecosystem energetics. And so hopefully we will talk about those Tuesday, right before the homework is due. But again, all of the variables are defined. There's an example there as well as in the textbook, and you can, if you're having trouble working through it, let me know. But it's something that hopefully will take you just a couple minutes. Do it now, do it during Thanksgiving, do it after Thanksgiving. That's the next thing that's due in this class. Okay. The other big thing on our agenda is that the last Friday of class, we will meet at 10:10 in the lab, and you will give us a rundown of your independent study project. Tell us what you did, why you did it, how you did it. Tell us the data that you got, what you think is significant from it, relate it to things that we've talked about in class or that you found interesting in the literature. You can stand there and talk to us. Show us your lab notebook. Okay. You can do a formal PowerPoint or Google, whatever slideshow presentation, or you can go to some other online nice presentation stuff and do a presentation and show us your graphs and pictures, tell us about things. You can make a video of you talking to us about it the day before and then show your video. Okay. It is up to you how you want to present. Definitely, it's like a 10 to 15 minute time frame for presentation. Like you did, hit the high points. Okay. It doesn't need to be an exhaustive rundown of every sweet little thing that you did. That's what you can put in your report. Okay. Definitely hit the highlights first on the presentation. We'll take some time. Everybody can ask each other questions. Okay. That's what's happening the last day of lab. And then that night right now, I have your independent study report due. Okay. And again, that's my current deadline for your report. 40 points possible given out across the different sections of the report. A chunk of that, 8 points of it, is your presentation Friday morning in class. If you're having questions, you want me to look at data with you, you're having trouble analyzing data either statistically or getting it graphed, like send me an email. Let's find a time and sit down. I'm happy to talk about it with you before Friday comes. All right. The very last thing is that our last exam in class will happen during finals week. So it is the Thursday of finals week is exam 3 in this class. And it will cover the topics that we've looked at since the second exam in class. So I have a study guide for you for that exam. And again, it is a good 2 weeks off. So you can start now or you can wait. Our exam is the Thursday of exam week. It's the 12th. And again, I'm giving you the information now. It is on Blackboard. When you choose to attack it is up to you. I definitely recognize that you have something else big in this class that's due, and you have probably most of your other exams before you hit your ecology and evolution.
But is it the final exam?
Yes. Exam 3, just this last unit, is the final exam. I think our exam on that Thursday, the 12th, it starts at 1:30 p.m. So recognize that it's a chunk of time that's not really normal class time. Okay. Let's continue talking about community. Okay. For the last week or so, we've been talking about community. So first we talked about what is a community, how do we quantify it, talk and describe it. And now we're talking about why certain species occur in certain combinations together and make these communities, make these interactions between organisms and ecosystems. Okay. And so we're in this portion of structuring and varying communities, what makes them occur where they do. We're today going to kind of wrap up talking about species interactions and focus on trophic cascades where we left off in class last Thursday. And then we're going to talk about how it's not just species interacting with each other, but the actual physical environment itself that causes communities to occur where they do. And then hopefully we'll get into how communities change over time. So we're really focused right now on how communities change over space. You walk from the prairie into the forest, down to the stream. But communities change over time too. And that's another huge factor in describing communities and appreciating communities. And it plays a huge role in land management when we think about conservation and preservation issues. Okay. So turn to your neighbor and based on class last Thursday, see if you can explain to them one indirect impact of wolf reintroduction into Yellowstone Park. So one indirect impact. So wolves directly eat elk. What happens besides that?
The tree increases.
Bears eat more bears. Bears eat more berries. The elks were eating the berries.
Yeah, and the food the elk were eating with the trees thing, I don't know what they're
Yeah.
called. That increases.
Yeah.
That's it, I guess.
Yeah, those are two good ones.
Okay, what do you think? Why does it matter that wolves got reintroduced to Yellowstone Park? I heard all the right answers. Yeah, exactly that. We have this trophic cascade that because we've changed one box in the trophic pyramid, we've changed these top predators, we affect not only their prey, the box right under them, but also the stuff under the elk that the elk was influencing. The wolves don't eat trees or berries or songbirds, and yet their reintroduction affected all of those types of organisms in ways that we maybe could have predicted if we'd really been thinking about these ecosystems, but were quite surprising in these types of indirect effects. There was a cascade of stuff that happened when you change one thing. And that those species interactions then have structured this community. The structure of the community in Yellowstone changed because we changed the predator-prey interaction between wolves and elk. And what's interesting is how quickly it changed. We did this predator reintroduction in the mid-1990s, and we saw effects almost immediately. Within 5 years, we were starting to see these effects and beginning to, because we noticed them, then to start to quantify them. And so change can be quite rapid, over the course of a season, and then in a community ecosystem-wide as certain interactions play out. So again, the wolves eat the elk because there are fewer elk eating berries. Because there are fewer of them, and there's more berries to feed grizzly bears. And that helps grizzly bear populations. It then changes the predation pressure of grizzly bears from other things now that they're supplementing with more berries. Again, we saw that for both aspens and willow trees, less elk meant less elk grazing on those plants, and as a result, then they grow taller, and the habitat that they provide for other organisms gets reestablished, either as nutrition or in this case as songbird nesting habitat. And so when elk grazing pressure is removed due to wolf predation, songbird diversity increases in these willow trees. And again, the wolves aren't directly interacting with these different levels of the food chain or the trophic pyramid, but they are definitely having an effect. So species interactions, competition, predation have an impact on community structure, presence, absence, as well as relative abundance. Okay. There are some other really classic studies in ecology about trophic cascades and community structure involving predator-prey and competition interactions. And so I'm going to tell you about two of them here. And the first one has to do with starfish as a keystone species in rocky intertidal communities. So on the seashore where you have rocks, you will get a whole bunch of these invertebrates that have hard shells that grow, and a whole bunch of little invertebrates of a variety of different types. And the presence and abundance of those organisms is determined first and foremost by chance, like who lands there gets to grow and will achieve competition for space. And then it's defined by competition with each other for space and resources. And then it's defined by the starfish predators. and that the starfish will come in and they will eat the most abundant organism in the rocky intertidal, whether it's clam or mussel or the barnacles or the limpets, they'll eat it. And by removing that organism, they change competition between the other species. And they call the restructuring of the community. The predator preferentially takes out the winner of competition, because that's the thing that's most abundant and easy to eat. And in doing so, then, they allow for those competitors to increase in abundance and increase diversity as a kind of full consequence of predation. So starfish eat a whole bunch of different stuff, and they do so, when they do it, they promote diversity. So these are very classic caging studies on the intertidal. They put out these big wire cages around the shoreline, and they will either have starfish in there, or they'll count species diversity before they did the caging, and then they'll compare it to species diversity after the removal and exclusion of the starfish. So without starfish predation, what does diversity look like? And you see that when starfish are allowed to predate, you get a lot higher diversity, about double what you do if you exclude the starfish. Without the starfish, the best competitors for space crowd out everybody else. With starfish picking them off, they allow the structure of the community to change and to become more even and more diverse, which is pretty phenomenal. And that's again why there aren't many starfish, they aren't relatively abundant, but they determine community structure. They're a keystone species through their feeding function. And again, the predator is eating a prey and it affects that organism's abundance and population, as well as that prey's competitors' abundance and population. Cool. This is an example of what's happening in these communities very often. If you exclude the sea stars, you pretty much over time will end up with a mussel-dominated community that is a monoculture of mussels, because they are the best competitors for space in the rocky intertidal. When you have starfish present, they will eat the mussels and open up space then for a variety of different organisms to exist. They act like a disturbance mechanism to open up space that the mussels had taken over. And in doing so, these predators really regulate competitor densities. Once the mussels get knocked back in terms of abundance, the starfish will switch to eating something else. And again, the mussels will come back, and then the starfish will eat more mussels, and it will change and vary over time, depending upon where we are in this cycle of predation-prey interaction. And we see this in the rocky intertidal, and then we see it in all kinds of other communities. That predation affects not only the direct prey item, but it benefits the competitors of that direct prey item. And it changes the relative abundance and species richness with predation from without. Okay, another nice example of this, it also comes from the intertidal region, where you have, as the high tide comes up and floods regions, and then it goes back down at low tide, and it leaves behind these little tide pools, little depressions on the seashore that are filled with seawater. And those communities then have a lot of different environmental stressors, but each little tide pool is its own little community. It's separated and segregated from other tide pools by the dry land at low tide. And so they develop individually. Even though there's mixing at high tide, each one is its own little community. And again, you can start to do experiments by changing community composition in these tide pools and then watching how they respond over time. And one of the more interesting results that came out of this was that there are these really complex species interactions that can result in specific endpoints in community succession and in community structure. And so in this experiment, these tide pool ecosystems, we have two species of algae. We have one that grows tall and kind of weed-like, has a bunch of strands that grow at the surface of the water. And then we've got this Irish moss, which grows more kind of like a coral. It's still like a fleshy algae, but it's much shorter, and it doesn't make a big canopy at the surface of the tide pool. We have a snail, and the snail will eat the long-growing green canopy-forming algae, preferably. We have crabs, which eat the snails, and we have gulls, which eat the crabs. Okay. And the development of these communities is dependent upon a few kind of chance events that happen early on in the tide pool's start. And so if you happen to have a tide pool that has a crab in it, the crab will eat the snails. And by eating the snails, then it allows long, tall algae to grow because the snails eat the short guy. And that canopy made by those long, tall algae protect the crab from getting eaten by the gull. And so the presence of the crab then creates a community that allows it to survive and hide from its own predators. If by chance in your tide pool, your crab gets eaten early on, before it gets to a chance to establish the tall green algae, the crab will get eaten because there isn't any hiding algae, which means that the snails can persist because there's no predator of them. The snails then will eat the long, tall algae and let the short stuff grow, which means that any crab that comes in will get found and eaten by a gull. And then this community of short algae with lots of snails persists. And so the chance events of do you have a crab or not, how quickly does your crab get found and eaten, structures your community. There are these interactions between species that are quite complex. And they're both these species interactions of predation and competition, but there are also these chance events of like, did your crab get eaten? Do you have a crab at all? And that again creates biodiversity. It means that there are fluctuations, both that we can predict and understand, and also some random chance events that are going to create, by chance, different little communities in different places, even if you have a relatively similar environment in all these different tide pools and the same types of physical conditions. You can get different results based on chance, as well as predation and competition interactions. Does everybody get that? And again, it's these trophic cascades of do you have a crab or not determines what type of algae grows and whether or not you have snails. And the type of algae that grows determines whether or not you have a crab. Okay, so again, they're self-sustaining, they're a bit of a loop and circular, and that organisms then create an environment which promotes their own growth and habitation. Okay, sure enough, we can look and see that predators, again, enhance biodiversity. When we have a predator that helps to reduce snail density, but then that pushes the community towards a particular type of algae and a lack of snails. When you have lots of snails and no crab, that pushes the community towards the other endpoint in terms of algae species and lots of snails. And you actually get the most diversity, as we're going to see several times in this discussion, when you have an intermediate number of snails, when you have intermediate predation, when you have intermediate disturbance, that lets both communities coexist. That lets most species have at least a foothold in the ecosystem. So again, in our human perspective, we like things to like reach an endpoint and stay there. And it's this recognition that communities change constantly, and that the greatest amount of diversity, either species-wise, genetic-wise, community-wise, happens as things are changing. And so change can actually be beneficial. Does this make sense? And these experiments are the classic examples, right? Like you could set up your old tide pool experiment and it might go totally differently. But they're textbook because they have defined these particular species interactions and relationships, and then they can tell us general principles and ideas that then, depending upon local conditions, will be true to a greater extent. Okay, so these types of trophic cascades and these types of species interactions are in general defined as top-down community structure controls, and that what is happening at higher trophic levels determine and influence what's happening at lower trophic levels, at in other guilds. That the types of predators that you have determine what herbivores are present and in what abundance, and because then certain herbivores are present, you'll have certain primary producers graze to a greater or lesser extent. And so predation controls species richness as well as relative abundance. And that predation then allows competitors to coexist by preferring the winner of competition that is most abundant, The predator then allows for the creep in of the other competitors and thereby promotes biodiversity. Okay? And this can be summarized that primary producers flourish because predators eat herbivores. Okay? Why is the world green? Because predators keep the herbivores in check. The idea of carrying capacity and of these fluctuations between predators and herbivores and other consumers. And the top-down control definitely is true in some communities, like Yellowstone, like these intertidal communities that we just talked about. There, the keystone species are these predators that influence competition and relative abundance of other organisms, which in turn influence competition and relative abundance of other organisms. But it doesn't work for all communities. Okay, it's always a spectrum. And it is a spectrum in community structure controls, just like it's a spectrum in variations over space and time for everything else that we've talked about in ecology. It's a spectrum of different adaptations and traits. Does anybody know what the opposite of top-down community control is?
Down up.
Yes,
Down out.
it is, and we call it bottom up, okay? It is down up, all right? Instead of top down, it's bottom up. And exactly, and once you know one, you kind of remember the other. And the bottom up hypothesis of community control and community structure determination is that the amount and types of primary producers and not predators determine what types of consumers are going to be present in that ecosystem. And this is the understanding that in order to live there, you've got to have primary production. Right? If you don't have a primary producer fixing carbon and producing excess energy to start the system, you can't have anything. And so, yes, predators are important, and definitely there are communities in which they are the dominant community structure organism. But in lots of communities, you can change who's there eating who. If you don't have a certain organism as a primary producer, you'll have a totally different community. And that this is the idea that, you know, we define ecosystems based on the vegetation that grows there. It's a grassland, it's a desert, it's a forest, it's a pine forest or an oak forest. The primary producer defines what consumers are there. And without them, with a different primary producer, you would get a different community. And then again, the idea here is that plants have evolved to protect themselves and consumers evolve in response. So because you have certain primary producers, you will have certain organisms that are adapted to utilizing them as nutrition as well as habitat. And the coevolution between primary producers and consumers produces the species interactions that we then observe. So this is the idea that not that the world is green because predators eat herbivores, but that the world is green because plants are prickly and taste bad. And thus they can avoid their own grazing and predation, even without predator control. And these two theories and hypotheses about community structure controls can compete with each other. We can have good examples of when each is true for a given community, but in most communities, they work in tandem. In that it is not just the primary producers, but also the species interactions that influence the presence and absence of certain primary producers. And that, as we've talked about, it's a cycle, and that things will change. And the understanding that primary producers and bottom-up control can be just as important as nutritional and predation competition controls is the understanding that the physical environment for a community defines what vegetation grows, which then defines what consumers and species interactions will take place. And so it's not just species interactions that structure communities, it's also the physical environment. So why do certain species occur where they do? Because they're in interaction with other species, also because that environment is what they are adapted for, either as a consumer or as a primary producer. Each species has its own temperature, pH, salinity tolerance. And so because the physical environment is such, those organisms will live there and create an interacting community. Okay. All right, so what are we talking about in terms of physical controls? And again, in terrestrial ecosystems, we're talking about climate, where we started with at the start of the term, is climate. And this idea of temperature precipitation regimes will give us certain types of vegetation. And then because we have certain types of vegetation, we will get certain vertical structure that gives habitat and nutrition for different organisms. And then because certain herbivores are there, certain predators will come in. What we also see in terms of vegetation interactions, of course, is that plants compete with each other. And that their growth rate, their light adaptation, their moisture adaptations, their nutrient adaptations play into where they occur and how they grow. And then because you have certain organisms, they might define what other plants grow in that particular. Okay. So on land, the climate really defines what plants will grow, and you get then a vertical height structure that again plays into competition between plants. It starts to influence species interaction. So we talked about, hopefully you remember, we talked about this in a few different ways. Plants are adapted and interactive with each other. Okay. In the water, the depth of the water has a big influence on what plants will grow. So again, in this terms of bottom-up control, the climate is what starts it on land, and its depth and thus light availability, which determines primary producers in the water. And so because we have certain vegetations in the water as on land, we'll get certain types of organisms. And again, different organisms and plants have different light adaptation, different temperature adaptation, different nutrient adaptation in the water. And just as on land, we get a vertical structure due to the plant growth, in the water, we get a vertical structure due to depth and light availability, and how light and temperature and salinity, gas availability change as we move through a water column. Again, we talked about thermoclines and haloclines and pictoclines at the beginning of class. That's important because it sets up the playing field for community structure and species interaction. All right. The result of this interaction between the physical environment and organisms is that we can observe zonation in communities. And zonation, again, is often seen most easily in small geographic areas like the shoreline, a marsh, a salt marsh, an intertidal zone, again, where you have this big range of temperature and salinity and desiccation in a short kind of physical range. We can see that communities occur in distinct bands or zones that align with certain physical conditions. And then we start to define those communities into these zones of similar groups of interacting organisms. And so changes in the physical and biological, the structures of communities as you move across the landscape, it gives us this changing interaction of communities. You go from the freshwater ecosystem to the grasses that can withstand a lot of flooding, to the grasses that do better and drier, to the trees that don't let their roots wet at all. And then as those primary producers change, you get different interacting consumers that are feeding on that different vegetation. But that's set up by an underlying difference in water availability and flooding in this ecosystem. So the idea again here is that as abiotic factors vary, so do the plants and then the consumers. And so again, a bottom-up control of what community is where. What species are where is defined by the base environmental conditions that we have to work with. And again, it works great in some ecosystems where you're like, look, different colors of algae grow in different places because they have different salinity tolerances. I can see the rainbow colors. And other places, it's less distinct. It's less obvious that that's what's happening. And again, across big spatial regions where you have similar abiotic conditions, zonation is going to be less obvious because you aren't observing the zones. You don't see the boundaries or the edges. All right. This zonation gives us a spatial structuring to our community. And it is a result of the interaction of those fundamental and realized niches that we talked about in competition. And that each species, again, has its set tolerances that set its fundamental niche. And then the species interaction create the actual realized niche. The result of combining everybody's realized niche is a given community. Okay? And so again, this is that the basic physical environment sets up what species occur where. And then they interact with each other to produce the end product of the community. Here again, we're looking at an intertidal, this time a sandy seashore ecosystem. You'll have certain types of organisms that live in the low tide region. You'll have some that live in the intertidal, and then you'll have organisms that do best up in the high tide, rarely inundated region. That's all based upon their tolerances for flooding and drying out and salinity and being able to breathe air and water or both and together or neither or one or the other. And then you layer onto that competition and predation to set up which species actually occur where and in what. In talking about communities is one of the days that I most miss living in Seattle, and we could go out and you could just like. The next time you go to the seashore, dig in 3 different spots. All right. Again, the spatial structure of the community is a result of the expression of the species' ecological niches. And again, in the intertidal zone, we see this interaction between these 2 species of barnacles. I think we talked about them when we talked about niches. This little brown guy can live all the way up here, but he's outcompeted for space by the purple barnacle. The purple barnacle can't live down here, and that then leaves an open ecological niche for the brown guy to exist. It's not the best place for the brown guy, but it's where he can live. Okay, and it's this interaction between fundamental niches and realized niches creates the community, the zonation that we use. Okay, that's cool and all, but it depends upon your perspective and at what scale you're viewing a community as to what zones you can define and what the boundaries are between communities. And so we often make these types of maps when we're saying that a given region has a particular community. It's dominated by these types of organisms. And this is, we have to do this in order to do land management. We have to do it if we're going to track endangered species. We have to do it if we're going to set a geographic region that's going to be minimum viable population size or minimum dynamic area. But the scale that you're looking at influences what you define as a community and where the edges and boundaries of those communities will be. And so we talk about these big swaths of this region as oak hickory or oak chestnut or mixed mesophytic and different interactions between species. But in each of these locations, there's individual organisms that are changing and varying in abundance. This is a generalization of what's happening. And that if you really want to drill down, you can see that there's more diversity in these big categories. It just depends on your scale of what geographic region you want to look at. If you want to be broad, you will gloss over stuff, but you can still see boundaries. If you want to look inside each of these, you'll start to see more diversity than the generalization might imply. Remember too that elevation, nearness to water, particular wind patterns will create micro pockets of very diverse communities inside these big kind of geographic conglomerations. Okay, it's a chapter. All right. The result is that you get spatial diversity, you get spatial heterogeneity, particularly in regions where 2 zones or 2 communities are coming together in these boundaries or ecotone regions. You get a lot of diversity in places where physical conditions allow for a variety of different organisms to interact. In general, we find that the more diversity you have, whether it's height, giving you a whole bunch of different vertical habitats, which is what is shown here, or a diversity of possible communities as you go across the landscape, you'll see increasing species richness in particular. You'll see more species diversity. And so here, we see that as the height of the trees increases, we see increasing bird species richness. And so again, the higher the trees that are growing, the more possible levels and zones there are in those trees. And so as a forest matures, you will get a point where you have very high species diversity, but then as all the trees grow to the same height, you'll begin to lose diversity again. Likewise, the more differences, the more microclimates you have, the more microhabitats you have, the more diversity you will assess. And so some of the hotspots of biological diversity for us on Earth are places where in a small geographic area you get a diversity of possible habitats. You get a diversity of different types of communities. So island ecosystems, when you go from the shore to a mountaintop, are excellent examples of this. That you move very rapidly over space between very divergent communities. You will have high species richness. Okay. We also see that it's not just habitat, but that the more different types of plants and primary producers you have, you not only increase the diversity of habitats for organisms, you increase the diversity of food. And so as you have more potential nutrition resources, you'll have a greater diversity of consumers that feed upon that diversity of possible food. So spatial heterogeneity also promotes diversity because of not just habitats, but different food resources. And so here we see that the number of bee species is pretty well related to the number of different woody forb species. So these are either perennial and sometimes annual little shrubs that have kind of woody stems, but they kind of grow usually about knee height. And it preys upon a whole bunch of different stuff, and of course they're pollinated by a variety of different insects. And so the greater diversity of plants you have, the greater diversity of bee pollinators you will have. Again, the idea that the primary producer influences community structure by providing a variety of different nutritional resources. Okay, that's cool and all. But as I mentioned, it's not just that species interactions or the physical environment cause a community to be structured the way it is, because there are these feedback interactions between species and their environment. And that, like the crab, which in the tide pool, which modified its environment to protect it from predation, there's an interaction between the organisms and their environment. And that because herbivores are grazing in an ecosystem, they promote the growth of grasses and they impede the growth of the forest. They promote the ecosystem that supports themselves. But the grasses wouldn't grow there to feed the herbivores to begin with unless you had certain climatic regimes to start. And so there's an interaction. They're not existing in isolation. And as a result, communities vary over space. You'll get one thing in one region, you'll get another thing in another, even with the same physical environment, because the species interactions are different. Or because the physical environment changes, you'll get different species interactions. And then as I mentioned with the tide pools and the rocky intertidal, it's chance. Like if you have a barren field, what starts to grow first just by chance of landing and germinating first will influence who develops afterwards and the types of consumers and habitats that develop as a result of the species interaction. So why are all species where they are?
Predator.
Good, that's one thing.
On their realized niche.
Good,
Temperature dependencies.
good,
That's for the bottom up stuff.
yeah.
Let's see.
We can pinpoint lots of things that cause organisms to be where they are. And you have to, what I want you to take home over Thanksgiving is that it varies, okay? What is the most important thing changes? And they interact with each other. And it's never just one thing. We can have these examples of, look, this community occurs because of this. The next tide pool over, it's a different story. So it's like, why do my husband and my mother not get along? It varies. There's lots of underlying reasons. All right. Cool. All right. So then, hopefully the other really important thing that I've started to talk about is that communities vary over time as well as space, and that in a given location, the community will change over time. And some of these are very, again, pinpoint things that we can say, this happened, the climate changed, a glacier retreated, humans came in and deforested. Sometimes there's a very particular disturbance that kicks off community succession and change over time. Sometimes it's much more gradual, but for any community, it is not static. And this again is something that is difficult for us as humans and as conservation biologists to deal with, because we want to manage for one thing and we have to be accepting of change. So communities vary over time as well as space. We can recognize this as a grassland feeding into a forest ecosystem, but when you start with bare earth, you'll go through the same community progression over time in one location. That changing of community dynamics over time is what we call ecological succession. And it's the normal, gradual time change in species composition and community structure at a given location. So community succession, ecosystem succession, is the normal, gradual change in species composition and communities for a given location over time. And there are certain species that tend to follow each other in a given climactic physical environment in terms of community succession in any given place. But again, chance and changing conditions can influence the final outcome of community succession. It's helpful to think of ecological succession as the regular replacement of one species by another. First, you'll have weedy plants that grow, then they're overtopped by shrubs, and the shrubs are overtopped by the slower growing trees. And then the trees shade out other things and kind of sustain and create a physical environment that promotes their own growth. We call a seer the sequence of communities that happens during ecological succession. In each individual community, we call that a seral stage. So a seer is a kind of series of changing communities during ecological succession, and each individual stage in a seer is a seral stage. And again, they look very like the different zones that you might see across a physical environment as you move from some conditions into another, this time with time rather than over space.
So that picture is an example of a seer.
Yes. So we're going from each individual seral stage as it changes over time. Okay, I have two communities for you to take a look at and to try to put them in their correct chronological order as they would happen in community succession. This is your in-class participation for today. I'm sure you could all forget.
When is our test?
It is December 12th,
You already gave us the
study guide.
awesome.
You can do it or you don't have to. Like if you want to be like, I have a ton of other stuff, do that. If you want to start it now.
Oh, that's from last time.
There is, you can do the community succession.
Into that, Olivia?
Okay, we have the two communities. The first one is the glacier one, and the second one is the abandoned field, top and the bottom. See if you can put them in order, what you think is first, and then second, and then third, and what the kind of final community would look like. And again, you're welcome to talk
abandoned
to Okay.
Oh, okay. I was like, tough.
I was kind of guess. Cool. I like that. Yeah. I think this could be like second or third stage. With moss and fiery. Looks like an early stage to me. Yeah.
Oh, because it's mature spruce, I see.
Okay. Once you put them in order, you can then think about, do you think this is an example of primary or secondary succession? You can maybe make some inferences about what those might mean.
This one's more. Well, I can have that as one. Well, that's a big community. Yeah, but the glacier melts. Oh, yeah, that's true. But then what about this? There's glaciers too.
No, that's a mountain. That's different.
There's
Mountains can be cold without them being a glacier.
1,
We're forest.
2, 3. That's good.
Whatever you choose to do.
So.
Do you think the first one will happen?
I'm thinking still.
And like,
Lightning on some rocks happens. I know that happens.
in Antarctica, because glaciers are melting.
Yeah.
What about the second one?
I just think that I don't know really. Oh, wait, shoot, forgot. No, I didn't. No, I didn't.
I'm gonna go. I don't want to see you anymore.
Okay, so primary.
Yeah.
Okay, so primary thing would be. Okay. Is that 3 or is that 3? I think I gotta change it back. So now I think about it. Why did I put 5? I was thinking 3. Maybe or 4. So this takes it back. I'm just gonna take everything back. I think that takes it. That takes it after that. That takes it after as a primary. So that one takes over that one.
Yeah.
And that one takes over that one. And that one takes over that one.
How sure are you?
I am like, I'm a solid like 12% sure.
Okay, are you ready to talk about them?
We are so ready.
Okay, great.
We did a thing.
All right, for our glacier one, what is first?
Glacier.
Glacier.
The glacier.
Glacier.
All right.
Rock.
And then the glacier recedes, and what happens next?
Lichen on a rock.
The lichen grows, and after the lichen grows, you get
Moss.
you get the moss and the fireweed. Is usually number 3.
I was always
Often confused for what happens fourth.
That was the alder and
The
the willow.
alder and the willow.
How do you know that one happened before the other?
Yeah, I was debating on that one because they're both in
These are the
rocky
two-
spots.
Yeah, these are the two that is like 1.5 dozen, 6 the other, right?
Yeah.
Okay, or like half dozen, 6 the other.
I was actually switched them between each other. a
Yeah,
couple
you can
times.
flip flop between, and so you can jump steps.
It's
Okay,
hard to
so
figure.
you might jump to the willow and the alder. The idea is that the willow and the alder trees are going to take longer to grow.
Okay.
And so something is going to be growing while they're growing up.
Gotcha.
And that's more the mosses and the lichens. Okay, after the alder and the willow come in, what do you get?
Cottonwood,
The cottonwood forest. And after the cottonwood comes the
spruce trees,
young spruce tree. And the last step then is the
and bale, spruce forest.
mature spruce forest. Okay. Do you think this is an example of primary or secondary production?
Secondary.
Succession, sorry. Indy says secondary.
Finally.
Do what?
Finally.
Final answer, it's primary succession. I mean, it's a guess, right? I haven't told you anything about them.
Yeah, I had no idea.
Primary succession will be the next slide here. It's when you start from bare rock. Okay, you have no soil to start with. It's primary succession.
Primary when you start from bare rock. Okay.
Yep, when you have no soil and you have to build soil. Remember we talked about soil at the beginning of class? If you have to build soil to start with, it's primary succession.
Didn't we talk about this like once in one class, like
Is abandoned.
months
Like
ago?
mentioned it briefly,
Yeah.
but now we're doing it in more detail, yeah.
Too.
We are talking about all the things I said I would talk about. Okay, where on earth is this type of primary succession after glacier retreat happening now?
Antarctica.
Yeah, a little bit in Antarctica, not to quite this extent. Canada, where the glaciers are retreating. Greenland, where the glaciers are really retreating. Yellowstone Glacier National Park, where these long-held glaciers are receding up the mountainside. Primary succession is taking place right now. And we will see this progression of different community composition over time. Okay, our second example, I'll tell you, it starts with the abandoned field. Okay. So after you have an abandoned agricultural field, what happens next?
The weedy annual.
The weedy annuals grow. Okay. And after them come the
Perennials.
perennials, the asters and the goldenrods that we're also familiar with. What comes after them?
Woody trees.
The woody trees like the cottonwood. And again, this idea that these hardwood trees grow faster and will achieve maturity sooner. And then they're going to be replaced by, after the cottonwoods, the
Beech and maple.
Beach maple.
the beech maple forest. Yeah. These bigger, older, longer-lived trees will eventually compete out the shorter-lived, faster-growing trees. Is this primary or secondary succession?
I got this. Secondary.
Secondary, that's right. We're starting with soil in place. We've taken one community that was there and we've wiped it out. You know, we took out the agricultural community and now it's going to be replaced by something else. And that community will change over time as these different species grow and reach maturity.
How would the abandoned field be just from like wildfire or just like
Yep.
man-made or something?
Yep, exactly.
It just doesn't produce enough
Right.
nutrients and they just leave it.
Yeah, here in the United States, we're in a process of having gone from forest and we deforested to do agriculture. And now both our economy and our land use has changed to where we are not doing as much agriculture as we did. And so we're leaving agricultural lands and they're reforesting. They're growing back into the forest that they were. So where is this process happening right now in terms of abandoned field secondary succession?
California.
California, good. We have these like wildfires and stuff.
In
are gross.
Ohio.
Here in Ohio, big time. Here in Ohio, we've dramatically increased our canopy cover as these artificial grasslands that we created from human interaction have regrown. You know, we do agriculture here in Ohio, like don't get me wrong, we still have this, but we have a lot of reforestation and regrowth of tree stands. And we are right now are observing that cottonwood, lightly hardwood forest. It's not yet the climax community endpoint of reforestation in our region. Okay. All right. That's it for the in-class activity. Make sure your name is on it and hand it back to you. And we'll talk about these terms that we just talked about. Woo. Everybody gets good.
Not everybody.
I know, parents. Oh, thank you. Can I tell you a funny thing that I saw? You know how the little kids always do the hand?
The hand turkey?
Oh, the little kids like always trace their hand and then they make the little turkey feathers. And then there was like, I saw this little internet cartoon and it was like, it was a little turkey and he like traced his tail feathers and he's like, look, it's a little kid's hand.
Oh,
That's funny.
that's pretty good.
So cute, right? It's just so. All right. So in community succession, we have these two different types of succession. We have primary succession and secondary succession. And in primary succession, as I just imagined, and you just saw, we start communities from bare rock. We have to build soil. And definitely in terms of community succession, we observe this most easily and talk about it most frequently as it happens on land, but it can happen in the water too. And so if you have a new lake that forms, that lake will go through a successional process of growing different types of plants first, and then as more dirt fills in, it gets shallower and different types of plants and animals will live in it. And eventually the lake fills up due to erosional infill, okay? There are different life stages to a lake or a pond or a river too. All right, the start of primary succession are with pioneer species. And pioneer species are usually life history organisms that grow rapidly with very little resources and have high reproductive capacity. They occur early on in succession, and they take advantage of the open ecological niche space, but then they're quickly outcompeted by K-life history organisms for the final community composition. So pioneer species are present early on in ecological succession. They tend to have high growth rates, both in terms of body mass building as well as population building. Small bodies, short lives, those annual plant species, those weeds that grow, reproduce, and then die. They tend again to be classic life history organisms, lots of offspring that disperse very rapidly, but then are given very little resources to start each offspring off with in life. And again, the parents often die immediately after reproducing, so there isn't a lot of parental life. Here we're looking at the rocky intertidal. And we see that the first type of algae that grows is this ulva species. They grow really quickly into abundance, and then they die off as the kind of wintertime cold snap hits them. They'll be present the second year, but after that amount of time, then they're going to start to be replaced by other types of algal species in the region. Okay. Those next species that come in are the late successional species. They come in after the pioneers. So again, in primary succession, we have locations that never had a community on them before. This happens in the glacier retreat that we just talked about. They happen on sand dunes, where you have the waves that have created and swept out a community. Either that wasn't there before, or we deposited new sand on a shoreline to build a community. Definitely new volcanic islands that rise up out of the ocean. That's a place for primary succession to take place. When you have a river that floods and deposits dirt on top of an existing community, we still consider that primary succession. We're going to restart succession based upon the new physical conditions. After those pioneer species come in and establish, they're replaced a couple years into it by the later successional species. These are more K life history and periodic life history organisms They grow slower, which means it has taken them time to establish, but they tend to be larger physically as well as longer lived. And so once they're established, they'll take up more space, they'll be better competitors for resources, and they will be able to live long enough to withstand changes in environmental conditions. They tend to have lower dispersal rates and per capita production, reproduction rates. Again, few offspring, given lots of resources and parental care, allows them to establish and persist as community members. And they'll outcompete and wipe out those pioneer species as they do so. So in the sand dune ecosystem, we come in with our pioneer species, the beach grass. That is then replaced by shrubs and bunch grass. And then after that, you will get the trees that come in after those shrubs have established. You get these later successional species. Okay. One thing we talked about, sears and seral stages. In documenting primary succession, it's hard for one researcher to observe the full life cycle of a geographic spot. Like it takes 80 to 150 years to observe full community succession from start to finish, and you're dead. You didn't even weren't interested when it was time to start. So we pieced together these successional interactions by looking at things like chronosequences, places where changes are happening at different rates, so that the different stages of community succession are all present in one geographic region, not at one site, but in one geographic region. So again, a volcanic island chain, where you have old islands that have been above the water for a long time, and new islands give you a chronosequence of ecological succession from young to old islands. As the glacier retreats, right where the glacier has retreated, you see the pioneer stage organisms. A region where the glacier has been retreated for a little bit longer, you'll see those alder, fireweed, willow type organisms. In places the glacier has been gone from even longer, you'll get the alder stage, the cottonwoods. When the glacier has been gone for a long time, you'll get the mature climax community. And so again, we're looking at Glacier Bay, which has experienced a huge change in glacier coverage in kind of the time frame that European humans have been involved with the ecosystem. You know, the glacier used to go right up essentially to the ocean front, and now today it's just a remnant of this in a few of the valleys. And we can see that as the land was exposed, it has changed the community composition over time. Eventually, this will look like the mature spruce forest, but it's going to take 250 years for that to happen. Okay, cool. Secondary succession then happens when we have a community after an ecosystem disturbance. We've had a community in place, it has been disturbed, and then a new community will come in on that essentially open niche space again. What develops can be different from what was there before. What develops can be the same as what was there before. It really depends upon physical conditions, species interactions, as to what community you get. Our old crop field that is then reforesting itself is an excellent example of secondary succession, as we just worked through. Again, what you get depends upon your climate in terms of different community members, and then also the individual organisms' life histories themselves. In this case, you're going to go from the kind of weeds into the shrubs. In this particular ecosystem, the pine trees are one of the intermediate successional stages, and that these quick growing pine trees come in, they get too old and they get eaten by insects and they fall over, and they're replaced by the longer lived hardwood trees. But again, notice that that full hardwood forest comes in 100 years later. You have one stage that's a full pine forest before you ever get to the hardwood stage. So places like Georgia and the Florida Panhandle, they're here in terms of this pine forest that's grown up as these fields have been abandoned or as people have changed their land use. Whether or not that ever makes it into the hardwood stage is open for anybody's question, because the pine forest there has lots of value for us as humans in terms of forestry and wood pulp and timber production. And I think that is likely a community that we want to sustain and kind of freeze it in that stage of ecological succession. Okay. Again, we can look at secondary succession as it happens in a seagrass bed. So seagrass beds, again, are these communities of flowering plants that grow in relatively shallow water and sandy soils. And a storm can cause a bunch of grasses to get picked up. A boat prop that runs through the seagrass bed will create what's called a skeg cut. And as that shallow boat propeller digs into the sand, it'll churn up and create an open space in the seagrass bed. There's algae that come in first before the seagrass is reestablished. And so even in this relatively stable ecosystem, a disturbed area will go through a series of plants and animals that live there before it reestablishes the dominant community for the region. Again, there are different organisms that will utilize different successional stages, just like there are different primary producers that are living in each of these stages. The algae, in terms of these little short guys, is really fast and quick growing. It takes longer for the algae and then the seagrass to actually come back. This is a classic case of the forest, and the tree falls over, and you get an open space. And that grasses and shrubs grow up quickly to replace this tree space, and it takes a while for the trees to reestablish. That's secondary community succession. All right, the end point of community succession is what we call a climax community. And a climax community is a stable community that will persist after a series of changes in a community over time. It is a community that the species interactions allow for that community to occur timelessly until you hit another disturbance. And that the species interactions are such that it promotes and creates a habitat for those species to exist and no others. For any given climate regime and disturbance, there are several different possibilities of climax communities that you can come out with. So chance of who establishes first, different dispersal rates, changes in climate can affect which climax community you get at the end. But once you get to one, they're relatively stable and pretty resilient to changes in both climate as well as species interactions. And so the sea otter forests are a great example of this, in that the sea otters eat sea urchins, and the sea urchins would normally graze the kelp forest away without the sea otters. The kelp forest provides the sea otters protection from their predators, nursery habitat, food resources. And so the sea otter builds a community that then supports its own presence in abundance. You change the sea otter, you'll change the urchin density and abundance, you'll change the kelp forest entirely. Without the kelp forest, the sea otters can't. Okay. We see that species diversity varies during succession as the different dominant primary producers change. So too will the consumers. It's again, community succession is strong evidence for the bottom-up idea of community structured determination. And that because certain primary producers are present, certain consumers are. Without those primary producers, they wouldn't be there at that time. And the competition between primary producers influences which ones are there, as well as the environment. What's interesting in all of these situations, though, is that the greatest diversity happens in disturbance, in transition. As we're moving from one successional stage to another, there's overlap. And that overlap is the time of greatest species richness and diversity. And again, we tend to associate high value with climax communities, but there are actually low points of primary production and species diversity. They can be high value in lots of other ways, but in some of our ecological measures, climax communities are not the best. Okay. And another thing that can influence the rate of succession and transition and change in species richness are growth rates and resource availability. and that if there are lots of nutrients available in the ecosystem, organisms grow quickly and will move quickly through these successional stages. If nutrients, water are rare, it delays the whole process. It will take more time. And again, that's common sense interactions. The physical environment influences community succession and community composition. But it's like, hey, that actually does happen. What we're seeing here is that as we change, again, at intermediate levels, we have the highest amount of species diversity. But if we increase growth rates, we'll move through our successional stages faster, and we have shorter periods of high diversity and high productivity. And again, this is an idea that the rate of change will vary. Species vary over space and time, and the rate at which change happens will vary with certain predictable abiotic conditions, like nutrient availability, like moisture levels on the protein. Okay, this is all leading to the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which is that a medium frequency of disturbance leads to the highest amount of diversity. If you have too much disturbance, you'll never get to the late successional stages and climax communities. You'll just constantly be restarting, and you'll see just the pioneer species over time. If you have an intermediate frequency of disturbance, you'll get to see all of the stages, and then you'll restart. You don't ever stabilize at an endpoint. And again, this plays into our ideas about land management. It's like, what is it that we want? Okay, do we want lots of diversity? Do we want lots of productivity? Or do we want to get to a stable endpoint? Okay, recognizing that that stability might provide us resiliency and certain known economic and social outputs from that community, but it's less diverse. Okay. And those are really important questions when it comes to interacting with our environment around us. And as we start to move from agriculture, managed ecosystems, perhaps back into more conservation land, like where do we want to end up on the scale? It's also the understanding that some disturbance is probably good and necessary in certain ecosystems in order to promote species richness and productivity, and that seasonal fire is something that the organisms are adapted for. When you exclude seasonal fire, when you exclude seasonal flooding, you affect community succession. You either cause it to happen too quickly or not at all, and there are consequences for that.
I thought the transition state had the highest.
Yeah, and so that's this idea that as you're moving from one community to another, you get the overlap of all of them. And so at some point, you've gotten to see all the different stages. And then if you let it go, you quit. You lose out some of your diversity.
Knowing like the relationships between like all of the species, can you like selectively disturb to like,
yes,
so you don't have to restart from point zero every time?
Right. And you could, again, this is the idea of land management, that you could till or burn an area and then you could reseed with a later successional species to skip the pioneer stage.
So the transition does have highest diversity.
Yes, yeah. And again, disturbances promote transitions.
Okay.
Disturbances reset the process. If it happens too frequently, you won't ever get a high diversity because you're just constantly restarting. But if it just happens every once in a while, it's good for you. It's kind of like the semester system. Like you take some classes and then you're ready for a reset. You get new information. But if you have a quarter system,
too much is not good.
Yeah, if you have a quarter system and you're constantly resetting and taking in little bits of information, like you actually learn less. Sweet. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you for coming the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Please take another protein bar if you would like it. Remember that homework 6